Thank you all for joining us. Appreciate you taking your time this afternoon to learn about MTSS here. My name is Jason Harlicker. I'm the director of the MTSS Center. You can see on the screen there's a lot of people around us to support the center. And then you'll see Sarah Arden and one of our staff members, Jenna Basil, will be presenting today. I just wanted to share two things before we get started. One, you're all likely familiar with the MTSS Center, but we're center funded through American Institutes for Research. So we do professional learning and coaching kind of across the country. Lots of ways to get in touch with us. So you can see via email. Encourage you to follow us on Twitter or LinkedIn. So we release a lot of free resources and we advertise those on there. This webinar will be recorded and then it'll be available on our YouTube page probably within the next couple of weeks. And then more information is our pamphlet that we'll put in there. As far as MTSS, I just want to share real quick how we kind of conceptualize it. We do these webinars to promote information and knowledge around MTSS, but really our focus is keeping things simple and accessible for schools and districts to implement. So one of our popular graphics and infographics on the screen there is our snapshot of MTSS. Ultimately, we're trying to build a system where schools can do those four things listed on the screen, screening all students and then using that data to adjust core instruction and provide interventions to students. So Kat Merkel is our center coordinator, and she just put that link in the chat for you all. But it's my pleasure to turn this over to Sarah Arden and Jenna Basil to get you going on 20 years of MTSS.
Thanks, Jason. Hi, everyone. I am Sarah Arden. I'm here with my colleague, Jenna. I'm going to introduce myself briefly and then let Jenna introduce herself, and then we'll get started. As we do that, I am thrilled to see a lot of very familiar names on the list of folks that are here, but also a lot of folks we don't know. So if you want to just briefly in the chat, introduce yourself, your name and your role so we can get a sense of who you are. We'd love to have a better idea of who's in the virtual room with us, and we're excited that so many of you are here. So we'll read over those as you put those in the chat. Like I said, I'm Sarah Arden. I advise the MTSS Center. I'm a principal researcher at AIR. I've been at AIR for 13 years or so. I'm also the director of the National Center on Intensive Intervention, NCII. So if any of you are familiar with the DBI work or NCII, that's work that really goes nicely sort of hand in hand with the MTSS Center. And I do a variety of other projects at AIR related to intervention and outcomes and assessment. So Jenna, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Sure thing. Hi, everyone. I'm Jenna Basil. I'm a researcher and a technical assistance provider here at AIR, American Institutes for Research. And I've been with the company a little over 2 years. And much of my work focuses on special education, MTSS, and literacy interventions for students with disabilities. And I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenna. And it's so fun watching the chat to see where you're from. I know we have a lot of folks from all over the states, but it looks like we've also got several colleagues and friends from Australia. We're really happy to have you here. I'm not going to calculate the time difference, but I think it's probably very late or very early for you. We know there's been a push to see this work expand across, across the ocean and overseas. And so we're happy for so many of you. I'm seeing, Ohio and Oregon and Illinois and people from all over, but several folks from all over the world. So that's great. We're thrilled that you're here. And so speaking of that, here's just a little bit of an agenda about what we're going to talk about today to give you a heads up and just to lay some of the groundwork. We're going to provide a little bit of context. We're going to spend some time talking about research and federal policy, kind of where we see MTSS now, some lessons from the field. We'll wrap up. We'll have some time to do Q&A at the end. You are welcome to engage in the chat box. I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. If you have Q&A, you can put them in the Q&A box also, so either one will get answered. We'll also provide you some resources and some materials as we go. So I'm going to get us started. So why are we here? I just want to sort of lay some honest groundwork about what we're here. So Jenna and I are not here to tell you or to provide you examples of all of the ways in which you can make MTSS work in your site right now. We know that there are a lot of questions about that, and we also have questions about that. But why we are here is to talk about how we got here. So how did the policy lead us to a place where we are in this current sort of landscape of MTSS? How does that policy work and sort of the history of that interact with the current research on MTSS? What does that tell us? And then if we can combine those two things, what are we learning from the field around our implementation work? What are we hearing from you? What are the sticking points? And are there some areas that we can help sort of clarify or sort of make the lines more clear as to what this is and what this isn't and how it works? There's a lot of questions about MTSS because it is a comprehensive framework. It's hard to study, it's hard to look at the impact, but we have a lot of faith in it as a system and as something that we can build in as an infrastructure support to really help students get access to what they need when they need it. So we're going to talk through all of those things today, and I want to just sort of give you a sense of why we're here and why we're doing that. So that being said, you can put this in the chat. I'm just curious, based on, I don't know all 75 of you, but I know some of you and can guess your answers here. Which one of these pictures really represents your understanding of both the research and the policy around MTSS? And as I'm looking at this, I'm realizing that most of these are frustrated. So, if you're picking one, two, three, or four, that is fine. But I am curious to sort of get a sense. We've got some fives. That's great. I love to see that. And I assumed we'd have kind of everything across the board. So we've got some folks feeling really, really strong. Folks feeling like the lift is very heavy, which is how I will describe number 4. Some people are feeling very Charlie Brownish and crying, which also is very acceptable. So thank you for your honesty there. I'm going to talk a little bit now about how we got here. So this is related to policy. And so please sort of allow us to indulge in just a little bit of history, how we got here. This is not a full comprehensive picture. It's a very light touch that describes how we got here. So if we're talking prior to 2004, so 21 plus years ago, a couple of decades here, the federal policy at the time and the work around education was really looking at reading intervention and behavior intervention often separately. And a lot of the intervention work was really born out of a focus on behavior that was done earlier. And so we can thank sort of our predecessors and the folks at PBIS, the Positive Behavior Intervention Support Centers, and those kind of folks for really looking and thinking at intervention during that time period. We start to see implementation of tiered systems embedded in policy like No Child Left Behind and some of the Reading First era, with just sort of an increased focus on these things. We also start to see emerging research studies or randomized control trials really exploring the impacts of intervention during this time. So it's sort of the birth of how we got to where we are. At the same time, during this era, we also start to see increasing numbers of students identified for special education under the category of specific learning disability. So multiple kind of components coming together here to think through. And we start to see federal investments in this time exploring these things. And when I say federal investments, what I mean are monies from the Department of Education, typically speaking, that are provided for folks to learn more or provide technical assistance or training around given topics. So we're starting to see federal investments during this time really around positive behavior support, so PBIS. And then there's a big investment in the National Center on Student Progress Monitoring. So we're starting to focus on intervention a bit, and we're focusing on monitoring student progress. And we move forward to the next decade-ish, if you will. And we start to see the reauthorization of IDEA in 2004, which is the federal law that mandates and governs how students with disabilities receive education. In that update in 2004, it included response to intervention, or RTI, as part of that reauthorization. So that was 21, almost 22 years ago. At that time, tiered systems were primarily associated with an alternate path for identifying students with disabilities outside of the discrepancy model, which was the most commonly used sort of mechanism at that time. So we start to see these conversations around maybe looking at intervention and response to intervention subsequently could be another path. This opens up sort of the zeitgeist and the conversation for talking about intervention, talking about it sort of as a tiered system. You probably have heard a lot of information around like this coming out of a medical model and talking about tiers. This all starts in about 2004, 2005 and expands beyond that. We start to see increased clarity out of the Department of Ed around this time about what does this mean and who owns it. And if you were an educator at this time, or maybe you were teaching, you might remember the conversations about who owns RTI, or response to intervention. Is this a special ed owned framework? Is this a general ed owned framework? Is it a collaborative one? There was a lot of discussion to be had around that. And during that time period, we had only a handful of states that were really promoting or providing guidance on how to do this statewide. It was less than 5 during that time. And so as a response to that, we start to see increased federal investments to focus on this. So we see the National Center on RTI is funded out of the Department of Education. We also see the National Center on Intensive Intervention being funded during this time period, though a little bit later. And so there's an increased sort of federal focus on this via investment dollars for folks to figure out what this is, how does it work in schools, how do we research it, how do we learn more. So that sort of gives you a sense of that first real decade of MTSS in the field. So before I go talk about where we are currently, I want you in the chat, if you don't mind putting and apologies for the people that are not US based. So this is a US question, but you can answer this question if you want. Currently speaking, so 2025, how many states do you think offer policy or guidance? So it doesn't actually have to be policy, it can be guidance on tiered systems on MTSS. I'd love to see your best. How many jelly beans are in the jar? I love the really specific guesses like 37 and 24 and the over-under guesses. So this may surprise you, but currently all 50 states have some kind of either policy and or guidance within their state systems around tiered systems. That is current. Now, it is not all policy. It is not all you have to do it and this is the state way we do it. Sometimes it's this is tiered systems and here's guidance on how to do it. But we do see this mentioned across all 50 states in the US as of current and in most of our territories and the Pacific entities and those kind of folks all focus on that. This kind of happened in this later decade where reauthorization of ESSA included the term multi-tiered system of support. That's not a typo, that's how it's listed. And we start to sort of focus more on, okay, we've learned a little bit about intervention, we focused on progress monitoring, we focused on sort of learning about the research behind this, and now we see all 50 states adopting some sort of guidance or policy towards it. During this last sort of decade of time, so 2015 to current, we also see additional investments in large-scale studies of MTSS. So we see this big MTSS behavior study funded out of the Institute for Education Sciences. Colloquially, we've called that MTSS-B. You might have heard of that. There's another one that looked at MTSS in reading. We see this big the evaluation of tiered systems done by Balu and that crew in 2015. And then we see all these other centers sort of being invested in, focusing on implementation, focusing on literacy via intervention. So we just sort of see a continued growing body of work that lands us where we are now, sort of in the policy space and guidance space related to MTSS. And just interestingly speaking, there has always been some dialogue and communication around who owns it and how do kids with disabilities access MTSS, and is it a special education policy or is it a general ed policy or does it live in teaching and learning? There's a lot of questions that exist across many states regarding this. And so just interestingly enough, although RTI and MTSS are frequently associated with kids with disabilities, those terms aren't included in special ed policy. So it's kind of murky waters out there, but I think just sort of if you're filling up your your toolbox with knowledge related to tiered systems, that's an interesting fact kind of to know. So here's where we are. I'm going to talk just a little bit more about policy, and then I'm going to hand this over to Jenna, who's going to talk about the research. And then hopefully combined, what you're going to start to learn from these two sort of disparate pieces of work is, what does this mean for implementation? How do we know where schools are getting stuck, and what do they need, and how can we help with that? So, like we said, there aren't states that have policies for comprehensive school-wide MTSS. Some have some policies related to SLD eligibility. Some have policies related to certain kinds of intervention or progress monitoring. But we see guidance across all 50. What we see more commonly is in the middle, policies that support implementation of MTSS related to a specific domain. So reading or behavior or mental health kind of components. And we also see that at more commonly targeted at specific grade levels. So we see a lot of policy related to dyslexia and early screening as it's connected to systems and intervention policy, or things like EWIMS and early warning monitoring systems in secondary schools, right? So we see sort of a combination of all sorts of things out there in the world. But like we've said, all 50 states have some kind of guidance and or policy. Some have their own individual policies. I'm not sure that I saw anyone from New Mexico on here, but New Mexico is an example where they call it MLSS, multi-layered systems of support. So some states have individual names for this. Some really, apply this at the behavioral or academic domains, and some just have sort of broad guidance. But the moral of the story here is, like, this is sort of out across the country, and it's something that we are all sort of consistently and collectively working towards. So with that little primer, I'm going to hand this to Jenna. Yes, the wild, wild west. You are right, Joyce. It is the Wild West, and then we wonder, why do we have questions about it? So that is an apt description. I'm going to pass this over to Jenna to talk a bit about some research related to MTSS, and then we're going to come back together and I'm going to talk about impacts on implementation.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. So I'm excited to talk to you all about a systematic review that we're conducting through the center. And I'll give you a little bit of background on the review. I won't dive too deep into our methods, but if you're interested, please feel free to reach out to us. And so I'm going to give you some of our preliminary findings. We're sort of in the thick of this review, and we're towards the analysis phase. So I'm excited to share some of those. So this review, for a little background, is focused on the historical context, current perspectives, and future directions of MTSS research. And we're looking at the years between 2004 and then about June to 2025. And so our research questions here are listed, and they focus on the historical timeline of MTSS. What's the landscape of peer-reviewed manuscripts on MTSS as a comprehensive system? And then what's missing from the research, and what does that mean for future directions? So that's where we are right now. So here's a little bit about the thematic landscape of what's been studied. And I won't dig too deep into each of these categories, but I wanted to give you a really nice overview of what we're finding. So we found about 381 articles that fit our inclusion criteria. And again, please reach out if you want to know more about our methods. But what we did find is that there are a couple different themes that rose throughout this research. And so what you'll see is some of those higher percentages, or the largest frequency of articles, were found within MTSS reports, perceptions of MTSS, special education in MTSS, and resources and infrastructure. So those are not surprising, but you'll see some of those smaller buckets are MTSS response papers, studies focused on interrupted learning. So that would be like COVID-19 and the pandemic, English language learners and studies that focus on those, and fidelity as well. So I'll move into the top 5 themes so I can give you a little bit of background. And we'll talk about equity, actually, so I will get there. That's sort of embedded within these themes. So these themes are sort of the most frequent that we found. And so you'll see that MTSS reports and commentary are quite large in the data here. And so we had about 89 studies that were narrative papers that summarized MTSS history, key issues, which may also be in equity in this case, policies and measurement challenges. And so those were studies that fell into there. And this is not surprising. And another one that was not surprising to us, another theme, was special education and MTSS. That was one of the most prevalent themes that we found within the research in these last 20 years. And those were papers that looked at not only identifying students with disabilities, but the impact of MTSS on referrals. Perceptions of MTSS, those were about 69 of the studies that we looked at, and those were capturing staff perceptions and knowledge about MTSS. So those that are doing the work, what they're seeing, and the qualitative data about their perceptions around MTSS as a system. And then resources and infrastructure sort of goes along with that perceptions piece, but those were the staffing and implementation resources that we needed for successful implementation of MTSS. And finally, you'll see it sort of drop. There were 29 articles that we found that looked at the impact of MTSS as a system. And so we were really looking for experimental studies that tested the effectiveness of MTSS overall on student outcomes. And so what we found when we were looking for those studies was there were a lot of manuscripts that focused on specific interventions within MTSS or specific tiers, but many were not looking at MTSS as a whole system. So I'll give you a really brief overview of a timeline of trends over time. So from 2004 to 2025, in 2004, because of the reauthorization of IDEA, we're seeing those foundational studies, expansion, and implementation. 2010, we're diversifying. We're looking at practitioner perspectives. Then we get towards 2015, 2019, and we're looking at implementation challenges. In 2020 to 2024, we're focused on sustainability of these systems, which again is not surprising with the landscape there. And then 2025, we're thinking about emerging directions. Okay, so to dig a little deeper into those. So 2004 to 2009, we had this IDEA reauthorization in 2004. And so we're really looking at these foundational expansion studies and implementation studies. And this is really defining MTSS and introducing progress monitoring, fidelity, and there's some early attention to English language learners in this piece as well, in this era as well. And this is where we're first seeing analyses and a shift towards evidence-based practices. Now, from 2010 to 2014, we are diversifying. We're looking at practitioner perspectives. So this is when research was exploding. We were seeing the largest volume of publications. MTSS really moved from a theory and a framework to a practice, and we're seeing it being implemented in systems, in school systems. So this was really a focus on practitioners who are implementing these systems, the fidelity, and translating this policy into real-world practice. And again, we're moving MTSS beyond reading and math and into other content areas during this time period. Now, from 2015 to 2019, we're starting to think about implementation challenges. So we're seeing a lot of research shifting from just implementation to what are the challenges to implementation. And so here's where that equity piece and those equity concerns come in. We're especially seeing that in secondary schools. And this is also when MTSS is expanding its research into mental health and trauma-informed practices. And we're seeing even more international comparisons here and the integration with Common Core. Now, 2020 to 2024, COVID-19 was certainly a catalyst for this interrupted learning piece. And so we saw a lot of research on that. We also saw that as a catalyst for mental health research and SEL. And there was a strong emphasis again on equity-based MTSS practices. And here we're seeing more technology-driven data use in the research and family engagement as well. So finally, that brings us to where we are today, 2025. So our study, we cut off our articles around June 2025. And so what we found so far this year is that research has continued to focus on COVID-19 aftermath and recovery, which is not surprising. There's also a renewed focus on ELLs and equity and fidelity. And then this exploration of complex needs and inclusion within MTSS and PBIS frameworks. So here are some just general observations over time that we wanted to highlight that we do feel like connect with practice. So we really have seen a shift from model building to systemic change. So we saw that early work really focused on foundations and theory of MTSS and integrating special education into tiered systems. But the later research really focuses on implementation and sustainability, and we're seeing a need for that now as well. There's also an expanded focus of MTSS moving away from, well, moving beyond academic interventions to whole child support. So, looking at mental health, SEL, and trauma informed practices. And finally, and one that I find most critical, is that practitioner voice and implementation science. Research really started to take into account that practitioner perspective to consider what barriers were being posed on these practitioners and then how implementation science was working. And I'm going to turn it back over to Sarah to make some connections here to the field.
Yeah.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Jenna. Before I do that, there's a question from Diane in the Q&A that I want to address. And I'm also curious, as I do this, whoops, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry, friends. To get your perspectives in the chat of if that timeline, both the federal policy timeline and then the timeline of the research, if that feels um, familiar to you, or if that sort of feels like what you anticipated it would be. I think, Joyce, to get to your question, we saw equity embedded throughout topics, not a lot of like, we're going to look at equity related to, but it was equity as it relates to assessment and outcomes, or equity as it relates to access to interventions and things like that. But we do really start to see it starting in about 2019, 2018, 2019, 2020, which likely aligns with what else was happening in the policy space, in the education space, just out there. So not a surprise to see that research happening then. Also, I think it will be interesting to see where that shifts and lives as we move forward out of 2024, 2025, and moving forward, align with sort of priorities for research funding and things moving forward as it relates to as it relates to MTSS. So I appreciate that. I don't want to make a value judgment here on whether we think that, what is happening with the equity space is hopefully coming across, that we're just trying to sort of report what we saw. And then Diane put a question in the Q&A about multi-tiered, where the S's go, what we make plural in the name multi-tiered system of support. I may have said it kind of in a confusing way earlier, so I didn't want to sort of convolute this, but we do see it as multi-tiered system, singular, of supports, plural. Sometimes when we're talking, it goes out quick, and sometimes we accidentally miss an S in there, so I appreciate that. I do actually think Diane's question was, does it matter? Does it matter where the S is? And I think this is a little lost in the sauce, but I do think we say it matters because we approach this, and the research approaches it, and we see this both in our lessons from implementation, that we encourage a singular system, a multi-level prevention system, right? Which means we're preventing students from not accessing what they need, not that we're preventing them from getting more, right? But that it's intended that we have a singular system in which we step in and provide students what they need, when they need it, how they need it. So while it is sort of a picky kind of integrated thing, we do see it as an integrated model, right? And as a singular system. Sometimes, if you've heard me talk before, you'll hear me refer to this as an organizing context. I don't know how in love with that language I am, but I do sort of like that we think of it as the way you do school. And so, yes, singular system, multiple supports. So I see some comments about integrated models. Hopefully that sort of clarifies. Yeah, an enabling context. Thanks, Joyce. Yeah, I see that. Sometimes we see it referred to as an ecosystem. Sometimes we see it like as this organizing context, that kind of thing. We get a lot of questions before I move on to kind of the implementation piece here. We get a lot of questions about how do you know, does MTSS work? And does the research tell us that MTSS works? And I'm hoping that question resonates with some of you. I can't see your actual reactions, but if you want to just like put something in the chat or a thumbs up or a something as to like, yes, we're getting that question too. One of my smartest and most talented colleagues, who's not on this call right now, but Dr. John Potter often says, asking if MTSS works is like asking if school works. right? It's a complicated question, and it's for who, under what conditions, under what things. So we have research that tells us that providing students with intervention that matches their need and delivering it with fidelity and then tracking their progress through psychometrically sound evaluation, right, works. We have that. We also know that when there is buy-in and when the mindset around that intervention or that MTSS is the organizing context or the enabling context that we have some research that tells us that that works absolutely. We also have a lot of research that tells us when implementation is poor, it doesn't work, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But yeah, Joyce, I think it's right. It's a deep question. Does school work? Right? It does for a lot of kids. It doesn't for a lot of kids. And so continuing this like open, honest conversation about how do we take the components of tiered systems and simplify and implement and really make sure that we are addressing the needs of the kids, with targeted interventions and assessment, I think is the goal here. I think it's a bit of a head scratcher to ask if it works, but I would say on our team, and the research would support this, we have a lot of faith in tiered systems as a framework, as an approach, as a way to get at making sure kids get what they need. So keep it up in the chat. If you have other questions, please chime in. But I'm going to move us forward a little bit to talk about okay, so now we're talking about policy. Now we're talking about research. What does that mean and what have we learned? So you likely knew this because I can tell who's in the chat, and tiered systems of support. So that should be different. That should say tiered system, but here we are, human out here with our S's. They were meant to enhance, right, the effects of general education or core programming. You would likely often hear us say you cannot intervene your way out of a tier 1 problem. You can't intervene your way out of a core instructional issue. So they were meant to enhance, not to replace. That is a position that we continue to agree with. It is not meant to come in and be the magic sauce or the sort of magic sprinkling of here, we're going to fix all of the kids. This is a collaborative effort. It is a unified system in which one piece necessitates the other. So I am curious in the chat, based on your knowledge, your expertise, the work that you have done, given that it's meant to enhance, not replace, it's meant to, collaborate, where do you think folks get stuck in implementation? So this can be in your state, in your schools, in your experience, in your individual classroom. Where do you think folks get really stuck? So I'm seeing infrastructure, tier 2. Yeah, lots of good guesses here. I'll watch a couple more of these come in. Yeah. Yeah, so somebody put in the chat talking about the adults. The adults are a place where they get stuck. One of my favorite colleagues that does really interesting work on MTSS is Dr. Steve Goodman out of Michigan. And one of my favorite things that he taught me, and that I steal this quote from all the time, is that MTSS or tiered systems, they require us to change adult behavior to change kid behavior. We have to change adult behavior as it relates to tier 1 or infrastructure or screening. And I'm not sure how many of you love changing your behavior, but adult behavior is very challenging to change. And so I appreciate that there's a comment in there, and I think I'm maybe misunderstood, but that is a component that is related to all of this. So this next slide shows you, and this is just based on, not just, but this is based on 105 schools that we have worked with over the just in 2025. So this data is aligned to, or these data are aligned to data from previous implementation measures and efforts. But here's where we see folks getting stuck. The most commonly, at least in the places where we are working. Now, I want to put a big caveat on this. that the center and our work at AIR, we don't often hear from places that say, hey, we have a system that's working really, really well. Can you help us make it better? We often hear from folks that say, we have a system that is not working at all, or we don't have a system yet. So there is sort of some bias in the way that these data are reflected, right? Just inherently by who it is that we hear from. But this is measured across our rubric on a scale of 1 to 5. And so 5 being the strongest implementation, 1 being sort of the lowest. And it is a self-reported rating. And the areas where we see people get stuck are progress monitoring, right? Infrastructure. So many of you guessed infrastructure, and that is true. And then in this tier 2, tier 3 space, we often see those very connected. Sometimes we see tier 3 actually scoring higher because folks tend to have a sense of like what we should do at the most intensive levels. It's tier 2 that feels the most amorphous or ambiguous, right? Everyone kind of goes there. We don't know what they need. We don't know whether they should be exited, things like that. And I saw some comments in there. So these data just reflect the work from across 100 schools across the country this year. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about each of those, and we have some resources. I think Jason's going to put the links to some of these resources up in the chat for you to address these issues. But the 3 I'm going to speak most about now are progress monitoring, lack of clarity around tier 2, what do we do? And then infrastructure needs, and specifically infrastructure needs related to purpose and teaming structures, but that does not mean those are the only infrastructure needs that we have. So related to progress monitoring, the research tells us, our implementation experience tells us, our being out in the field sort of tells us that there are recurring and predictable reasons that folks may get stuck progress monitoring. And they are things like time and logistics. Who is going to do it? How are we going to get this done regularly across we have some folks that we work with in elementary schools and some of our big states that have well over 1,000 students in those schools, right? And so how do we logistically come up with a plan to do this? And that's a big piece of it. Also, inconsistent training. And what I mean by inconsistent training is not just administration issues, but also training around what is progress monitoring and why is it important and how is it different but related to monitoring of progress. Having folks really understand around general outcome measures, which is what most progress monitoring does, and why that's important and why it becomes a really invaluable tool, and how it can be not just more data, but usable data, right? How do we take what we learn from progress monitoring and use it to guide our intervention and guide our instruction, not just to physically group students into spaces, which is what it's commonly used for. Another sort of recurring and predictable reason that we see people get stuck in progress monitoring is just a lack of data fluency. We have so much data and we're not sure what it means or what to do with it. What we know is that we have these data and they indicate some kids are green and some are yellow and some are red. But what do we do with that and how do they switch and where does that take us instructionally? It's a problem. It is a big ask to need all folks to understand that. So we have a couple of resources from the MTSS Center that we think address these. I just saw Jason put these in the chat. The bottom left of this, so if you look at this graphic down here, there's an infographic that I think really is helpful in summarizing the key features of progress monitoring tools and the process, and really shares in a simple, digestible, easy to understand way, like what is progress monitoring doing and how are we using it to analyze growth? I think there's a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions about progress monitoring and the role of it. So we're hopeful that this sort of key features can be something that you share out. Maybe you're training staff, maybe you're talking to family, maybe you're talking to other schools, or you're a state person and you're wanting to kind of get this going, sort of around just the intention. Yeah, the link is posted just above your question, Melanie, but we can definitely put it in the chat again as well if you need it. And then on the right-hand side, there's an article. Oh, interesting. Jason, can you double check those links and make sure they're posted? And we will make sure to share them again as well. And then on the right-hand side, there's an article that just talks about ways that we can make the progress monitoring process and decision-making easier and more effective. And so we want to make sure that we're understanding and that we're using sort of the process not just as an additional thing to tell folks to do, right? To say, well, as part of a sound and comprehensive multi-tiered system of support, you need to progress monitor, but maybe understanding the why and understanding, do we have a right tool and how are we setting achievable goals during those things? So it's sort of curating and streamlining, simplifying the process. And hopefully that sort of the complementary of those two products can help you think about it. There's a lot of work on the MTSS Center around progress monitoring, but these were sort of two key components that we wanted to share with you. And then let's talk about tier 2 and the lack of clarity around tier 2. If you have heard me present before, and this is a comment that maybe some of our younger folks in the chat won't, or in the audience won't recognize, but sometimes I have referred to tier 2 as like the Hotel California of tiers. Like no one knows how you got in, no one knows how you get out, you can never leave. How did we all get here, right? And so it really is sort of an amorphous and ambiguous chunk of instruction. And there is a real need to clearly define, to sharpen the parameters around what tier 2 is and what it isn't. It becomes very easy for tier 2 to become a catch-all when we have core instruction that is not working, when we have tier 1 instruction that is not successful, right? And so defining tier 2, clearing up some of this sort of conceptual ambiguity. What is it? Is it more tier 1? Is it actually using a standard package program? What does that mean? And how do you get in and out? I'm really glad that Hotel California resonated with several of you folks, because one time I did this with a group of brand new teachers and they were like, what are you talking about? I have no idea what that is. But regardless of that, right, understanding sort of the conceptual ambiguity around it is really important. Addressing kind of the inconsistent decision-making. When does a student move into or out of tier 2? Have we set up some artificial parameters around tiers, maybe in a way that isn't serving us, right? We've made it sort of this continuum, but have we actually inadvertently made it just a location? And then really a lack of tools that match student need. That's another big issue we see when we see tier 2. We see students are identified as needing tier 2 through obviously some sort of progress monitoring. And then what commonly happens, I think maybe this will resonate with several of you, is students are just provided the intervention that the school has. The one that they have enough site licenses for, or the one reading intervention that is available, right? Instead of applying them as a direct match. And that then automatically starts us off going the wrong direction because we aren't providing an intervention as a match to a student need. This gets at the infrastructure needs as well, right? But you can see how we have sort of put in all of the ingredients into making a really, really complicated tier 2 system. So we have a few resources we want to point you to as you start to think about better defining, right? Or sharpening the lines around your tier 2. And maybe as you sharpen some of those lines, some of them become a little blurrier. Maybe you blur some lines as well. So on the left-hand side at the bottom of the screen, you're going to see an infographic that highlights kind of 10 features of effective tier 2. I think that one can be really powerful when you're meeting as a team and you're talking about sort of continuation of supports and you're talking about what is tier 2 and what isn't and how do we decide. I think it is a really nice, simple document and doesn't get too in the weeds and can really allow for some nice conversation around being, just like you said, Trisha, readily available to provide student support that matches their needs. And then on the right-hand side, we provide sort of a tool that gives educators or states or schools or folks that are working on this a systematic way to examine what you currently have in place for tier 2. So we understand that a lot of schools are just given what they have, and that's what you have to use, and you have to sort out how to a way to make that work, right? But the reality is, if we want to impact student outcomes, if we want to make sure that students have meaningful, just-in-time access to the kinds of instruction that is going to promote them and get them to where they need to go, that we are looking at the tools that we provide them, the instruction, the curriculum, and make sure that that is a match for their needs. So there's several tools in which you can do this, and I've provided you one on the right. If you're someone that's wondering, do our tools match? Do they make sense? Will they guide sort of our instruction? So again, aligned to the research and aligned to what we see in the field as well. And then the last one, infrastructure. Infrastructure is not a surprise that it comes up here. It's also one of those that we have a propensity to blame. I can't do it because of the schedule. I can't do it because of the infrastructure. We're not built to do this. And so we get ourselves into kind of a complicated system here where we blame something that actually we made and then it isn't working, but it's hard to disentangle because we have adults and we're changing behaviors. And so infrastructure is a really important one to really take a look at and dig deep into. I will say that in schools where I have seen MTSS or tiered systems work the best are also schools that have very clearly defined roles, very clearly defined infrastructure, and a plan set up for who does what. Kind of the theme being, if it's everybody's job, it's nobody's job. And so we have to really sort of align and clarify who does what as it relates to both the humans in the infrastructure and the system that exists there. So we see that even when schools really deeply commit to this, infrastructure gaps can really derail implementation. So insufficient time, right? You get your one MTSS training day a year and then go do it, right? Or your team roles are vague. No one is sort of defined what's special ed's role, what's the interventionist role, what's the general ed teacher's role, how do we work together, how do we work separately? So really that can definitely get in the way. And then really talking about buy-in. Buy-in beyond, do you believe in this? But buy-in meaning, are you willing to commit to changing your practice to make this happen? So it's kind of buy-in plus, if you will. And so we see those as barriers and ones in which we hope to kind of address some of these pieces. So again, a couple of resources for you here. We love talking about this work on the center. So if you want to talk about it more, we are happy to do that. There's 2 tip sheets. It looks like Jason's put them in the chat here. But the first one is really talking about crafting the proactive steps that are required for not only buy-in, but understanding of MTSS and really building a culture around MTSS as an ecosystem or as how we do school, right? As the organizing or enabling context. And then on the right, we've provided a team's audit activity, right? And so sometimes what we see when we go into schools is there are too many teams. You have teams of teachers talking about the same students in different times and different topics, and nobody wants to give up their meeting or their team, right? Or maybe you do an audit and you realize, gosh, we don't have a team of teachers that's looking at XYZ or this topic or, discussing exit and entry points or database decisions, things like that. And so we encourage you, if you're someone who really wants to think about infrastructure, to think about how it's related to buy-in, leadership, understanding, and then also making sure you have teams with really clearly defined roles and processes in place. So we have a lot of resources to help you with that. We do a lot of work around that. And so incorporating this into your existing teams, as Joyce is putting in the chat, really is another really highly suggested thing, sort of letting MTSS infiltrate or get in the water, if you will. So those are the resources we want to share. And just to kind of give you a sense to wrap up, and then we have a few minutes at the end for questions here if you have more. This is a 2023 study, so it was done out of EdWeek. It was looked at I think it was about 450 schools at that time through Panorama and a collaboration with EdWeek around where are we now. And this is just sort of another self-report, but it gives you a sense of what these hundreds of schools across the country indicated. Where are you in your implementation 2019 to 2023? Again, big old caveat here because there was a lot going on in the world between 2019 and 2023. And if you were someone who taught virtually and tried to do intervention, Jenna did that during COVID, then I have so much respect for the work you did. But keep that kind of caveat in mind here where we're talking about where are we. So you can kind of see like folks felt like they were really in the midst of rolling out tiered systems in 2019. That dropped in 2023, but you'll see an increase in both the just beginning and well-established. So theoretically, folks were moving more towards implementation of comprehensive systems here. Again, remembering what was happening in the context in the world as it relates to implementations kind of nationally here. And then this other one I just thought was interesting is sort of the shift in where we're starting to see content related to intervention. And there's an increasing shift on what we're hearing and what we're calling instructional coherence. If you're hearing about that, and it's sort of making sure that we are intervening in all of the right places and simplifying the programs for students as they go throughout their day. But not surprising, typically we saw the most intervention across the country happening in reading and language arts. The research will indicate that that is where a lot of the federal money came from. There is more research on intervention and literacy or reading. And so that is not a surprise. Within behavior as a secondary, sort of, we saw more of that in 2019 than in 2023. So just a slight drop, but not significant. Math is slightly behind there. Probably not surprising to anyone in this room. We saw a significant increase in intervention related to social emotional learning during this time period. I think that reflects both the era, the mental health needs, what was happening during the pandemic, and a real sort of need from the field to say, gosh, what do we do and how do we address this? And then increasing focus on attendance. This is a hypothesis. It's informed based on what I see sort of in the field. I think we're going to see attendance significantly increase across the next several years. We're starting to hear folks focus on that more and more and more, in addition to some other components. But I do think we're going to start to hear as a field quite a bit more about attendance and how we address attendance as it relates to one of the components of these comprehensive systems. So I think, yeah, you're right, Joyce. Intervention doesn't work if you're not in school. And also school doesn't work if you come and it doesn't meet your needs, right? And so we want to talk about attendance and we want to talk about engagement. The last slide here is just sort of some preliminary key takeaways from the combination of our research and what we just talked about. We also have a few minutes left, so if you have comments, if you have questions, please let us know, put them in the Q&A box or in the chat and we'll address them. I'm going to kind of talk through this. Jenna, please chime in here too. What we see in the MTSS research is that it is both broad and fragmented. So what Jenna did not mention is that of the 380 studies that met our inclusion criteria, Jenna, how many did we start with? Like 2,500?
Yeah,
Thousands.
something around that.
Yeah, thousands and thousands of studies.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to focus on kind of the topics that Jenna said. But what we see here is a lot of research called MTSS research. But what it does is it looks at, does this specific intervention work for this specific kid in this one thing? And for us, that was more sort of tier 2 or intervention research, less on the broad kind of conceptual framework of a tiered system. There's a lot of focus on implementation and perceptions. But because it is such a complicated system in which to study, and there are so many variables and so many compounding factors, it is hard to study the impact of MTSS as a comprehensive system in the same way that it is hard to study, does school work, right? That's sort of what we see. But that being said, we do feel like it would be great if there is more rigorous and integrated or outcomes focused research on MTSS. We need more information about what works and what it doesn't work. I also anticipate we're going to start to see a shift towards simplification. I think we've gotten, my sort of personal take on this is there are some components of this that we've gotten a little lost in the sauce and we've made things quite challenging. And so I do think we want to talk about sort of student outcomes across domains. So this is getting at like the attention piece or attendance piece, sorry, or the SEL piece. That kind of stuff, and then really sort of looking at system-wide evaluations. So I don't know if you have anything to add to this, Jenna. I'm going to look at some of these questions as well and make sure we try to address them in our last couple of minutes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that we did look at about 5,000 articles at first, so double what we thought.
Yeah, it was a lot of articles around there. So I would say, Jessica, to your question about top 2 non-negotiables to start implementing, in secondary schools. That is a great question. MTSS implementation in secondary schools, and I bet Jason's really happy because he said you're going to get a question about secondary schools. Um, we've been doing a lot of focus on early warning systems in secondary schools, honestly. And the other thing I think is important, and Jenna and Jason, please come off the chat and chime in here on the secondary school piece. A big piece of our work so far in secondary schools, and I'm not sure this is going to exactly answer your question, but is buy-in and training, educator training. So you've got a lot of educators that aren't trained to provide intervention or understand the connection between intervention, content recovery, and credit accrual, which is kind of the magic equation in secondary schools. And so doing some deep work in your system at secondary school to make sure folks understand the role of each of those components can really help you build in a lot of success as it relates to tier 2. Jason or Jenna, anything to add to that?
I think communication is critical at secondary because the sheer number of teachers. So communication plan, and then I would say understanding the role of screening. You shift from screening basic skills primarily in elementary school to screening for school engagement or school dropout. And so understanding measuring risk at the secondary level is a little different.
Yeah, that's great, Jason. Joyce has a question about district level implementation. So systems level consideration, kind of going into the like what are the big levers that we can push as it relates to districts helping schools. I think, again, I'm going to just rely on what Jason just said, but Joyce, we see clear direction and clear parameters. And when we see districts roll out, this is the role of special education, this is the role of general education, this is the role of our interventionists, and how they work together and what like progress monitoring means, we see a lot of success. The other thing that we see when districts implement MTSS really well is sort of an alleviation of barriers of access to high quality intervention materials and access to psychometrically sound assessments and high quality core instruction. Again, that was sort of like all of the things, but when we don't have those and we don't have clear communication at a district level to a school, what we see are pockets of excellence, and we see sort of disintegration in places where there just is not consistent sort of clear communication around the expectation of MTSS. We do a lot of district work. So Joyce, if you want to talk about that further, for any of you, we're happy to discuss that and making sure that there's simplification and clarity. I'm trying to look through in our last 2 or 3 minutes here, other questions. There's another John Potter quote, district standardize and schools customize is a really good way to think about this. Yeah. Yeah, Rachel asked a question about mathematics and MTSS. And we very honestly don't see a lot of schools focus on mathematics and MTSS. They often focus on MTSS and reading. That being said, I think he's still on the call. Yeah, Bill Resplica is here. And he was a special ed director of Franklin Pierce, where we did a 5-year study implementing MTSS in mathematics across elementary and middle schools. And one of the biggest barriers that we bumped into, and I can send you some resources around this if you're interested in it, is the difference in the language, the sort of lack of coherence between core instruction and tiered interventions. Mathematics was taught essentially in a different language in intervention than it was in core instruction, which allowed for and created sort of a system that made it really complicated for students who are struggling learners to understand what they were being taught. So one of the biggest barriers and the biggest issues that we've addressed in tiered systems in mathematics is really sort of crosswalking and understanding, building in some coherence between your core instruction and your intervention programs. There are several crosswalks. These live on the National Center on Intensive Intervention website, but I will send them out and we can put them on here around like, how did we address that? Because that's a different need than we saw in English language arts. And we had a lot of success in identifying that. So I can pull those up and make sure that folks have access to those. Other questions? There's one last question that I'll get to here about how do we empower schools to assign roles to content and teams and that kind of thing. Again, I can't speak to individual union concerns because obviously those are unique across individual schools. What we find is there's a lot of power in doing some work around mindset and around buy-in. Some of this is really leans heavily on the PLC research and those sorts of things. But we feel very strongly, and we do a lot of work on this on the MTSS Center around the kind of mindset that is required to do this. And one of the components is like, we believe all students can learn when given the right supports, right? Or that kind of thing. But we get a little deeper into that because we want to say, like, okay, you believe it, but show me what that means. How have you assigned people to do this work? Another one of our sort of mindset components that we talk about sometimes is this co-ownership of student data. And so if you are a building that actually has that and you believe in the co-ownership of student data as a lever to impact outcomes, then assigning the roles out and making sure someone is responsible for it becomes inherent in your practice. It just becomes how you do things. Getting to that is really challenging. So I know that's a really brief way in our last minute to get at that question. But if we want to impact outcomes, someone has to be responsible for getting us to those outcomes. And if we don't do it, if we don't assign it, then it's no one's job. And then we know from the research and the practice that it doesn't happen. So I don't know if that quick answer is helpful for you, Ricardo, but that is definitely an area that we spend a lot of time on. So we're right at time. I appreciate you all being here and being so attentive and asking such good questions. For those of us that are in this work all of the time, it is nice to see other people that are in this work all of the time asking really hard and important questions. So Jason or Jenna, anything as we wrap up?
Can you just go to the next slide? Let them see that one last piece.
Yeah.
So if people are interested in follow-up, because there were a lot of questions that maybe we didn't quite get to, please fill out the survey link I just put in the chat, and then we can follow up with you there.
Perfect.
But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I
you.
appreciate you being here. And we look forward to hearing from you. Have a great rest of your day.